I'm Teresa Ghilarducci. I'm the chair of the economics department, the director of the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis, which is part of the Department of Economics. And tonight we are going to do a new school event where we have colleagues from the Milano School of Public Policy and the economist and a political scientist from the New School for Social Research talking tonight about the budget process. We framed it with wondering if that budget process is working, and we've asked whether or not the nation is ungovernable because of what's happening with the budget process. I want to give a shout out to Dean Neil Grabeau, who is the dean of the Milano School, because he suggested this event sometime, I think, after Christmas, saying, really, we should talk to the community of students, of scholars at the New School, and the community in New York about the way we're viewing what's going on in Washington. So I would like to invite our president, David Vanzant, who will give some welcoming remarks and to frame some of these issues up for us, and then I'll introduce the panel, and then we'll start our event. So, President Vanzant.
Good. Well, thank you, Teresa, and welcome everyone tonight. I'm glad that we could provide a Valentine's date for so many people. What better way to spend Valentine's Day?
That's what I told my students.
Is that right? Good.
Right? How many from my class? All right.
There we go. Hey, okay. Well, you know, just on the way over here, I looked on my cell phone to see that the Senate had, or the Republicans in the Senate had succeeded in filibustering one of their own, Chuck Hagel, for the position of Secretary of Defense. Oh. And that's what makes this program particularly timely and important tonight because of what's going on in D.C., but it also exemplifies the New School's commitment to public discourse, engagement with critical issues of our time. Also is seeking innovative and creative ways to resolve very complex social problems. The question at hand tonight, I don't think is particularly simple. It gets at the foundation of how our nation makes policy, how we represent democracy in an interconnected world, and how a desire for positive change can produce tangible results. We have 4 great members of our faculty here tonight. All of them, actually 1 political scientist and 3 economists, right? Do I have that right?
Yeah, yeah.
All right, from our various departments.
It takes 3 of us to deal with one of them.
It does. But I think it's great that we pulled together across the entire spectrum of the New School these 4 people, we just have a tremendous amount of talent across the school, even though some of our divisions and departments are rather small. Well, tonight they're going to explore Social Security and Medicare. I think Teresa's going to talk on that. Rick McGahey is going to discuss debt limits, the debt limits debate. Dirk Hamilton is going to talk about inequality and asset building. And finally, David Plotke will talk about political polarization. I mean, ultimately, I think these issues lead to some broader, tougher questions. Can the government really make effective fiscal policy? And also, how will not doing so affect ordinary workers and vulnerable populations? It also, and I think it is happening, sends a dangerous perception of U.S. dysfunction abroad. You know, as we are facing a period of sluggish economic growth, the need for clear and thoughtful policy is ever more present. And it's important I think it's very important we avoid another recession. I think it's especially true because there certainly are signs that the economy is picking up right now, and it'd be a shame if Washington buried it again. Other people in Washington are doing their parts. For better or for worse, the Federal Reserve Board has picked up some of the slack. It's engaged in quantitative easing, and buying an unprecedented amount of private sector bonds, keeping interest rates low. Many of us worry about the long-term consequences of that, but the Federal Reserve is the only party acting right now, as far as I can tell, in Washington. And I think it's true, and I put blame on both sides here. Both Congress and the President are really not doing their parts. they're threatening each other. It's a lot of posturing. I think it game what game theorists call chicken, who's going to go off the cliff or who's going to push us off the cliff, and when they're doing all sorts of things, including threatening to not extend the debt limits. Both the President and Congress are taking publicly very hard negotiating positions. That's never a good dynamic for negotiations. Any of you who've ever read Urey and Fisher's Getting to Yes will know this is the last thing you do if you're trying to get something out of a negotiation. But that doesn't dissuade either our president or our members of Congress. We also need a serious discussion about Social Security and Medicare reforms. But I'm afraid that in D.C. today, those discussions are really reduced to either claims about their ultimate unaffordability or drawing of lines in the sands about affecting or touching benefits. And as we keep doing that, there are ever higher levels of debt are being incurred, which imply higher interest rates in the future. And also, and I think this is probably more unfortunate, they reduce the room that we have in fiscal policy to make moves to affect cyclical events that happen within the economy. So I've laid out a big, area of issues to cover, and I am sure as we sit here tonight, we're going to get definitive answers to each and every one of these questions. So let me turn it back to Teresa. Thank you all for being here tonight.
We have a great crowd. Let me just tell you the ground rules. Each speaker will introduce themselves. You should know who you're dealing with. We won't speak longer than 10 minutes to make sure that you have a chance to ask questions. Because we have a big crowd, I would like to limit your question to maybe 1 or 2 sentences so you can write them out. We're going to call on new school students first and invite undergraduates to also speak up, and then members of the community. So our first speaker is Professor McGahey.
Thanks. I don't know if my introduction comes off my 10 minutes, so I'll make it short. I teach in the urban policy program at the Milano School. I guess my claim to being here is I have a fair amount of Washington experience. I was the executive director of the Joint Economic Committee of the Congress, an assistant secretary of labor in President Clinton's second term, and especially proud of I was economic policy advisor to Senator Edward Kennedy for several years. So and here we are. Yeah, I agree. I miss him a lot. We all miss him. So the political economy of the federal budget. I'm going to talk just a little bit how we got into this mess where we are economically, but also try and explain a little bit about the mechanics of what's going on there politically. Unlike President Vanzant, I'm not going to be bipartisan in my blame. And I can advance this thing by taking off the number lock and hitting the arrow. There we go. So we have built up significant debt. Economists like to talk about stocks and flows. Think about a bathtub, right? A bathtub, slowly the water comes out from the faucet. That's the stock, that's the flow. It's a little late. And eventually you get a lot of water in the bathtub. That's the stock. And so every year that we add to the deficit and debt are not the same thing, right? Every year we have a deficit, we borrow more money, and we get this big bathtub full of debt. And that's what we've got now. The deficit's actually coming down some now, as we'll see here, but we've got this huge volume of debt that has built up, and working that off seems next to impossible. Reinhardt and Rogoff, two economists, have said if you look at countries, when they get about to a 90% debt to gross domestic product ratio, then you're in danger territory. We're in the high to mid-80s. And have been there for a while. Our weak growth, President Vanzant mentioned that it's adding to the debt. If we could increase growth annually by just 1% every year over 10 years, we'd knock down the debt by $3 trillion. This is, I believe that where'd it come from? We don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but it was really Bush-era policies. This is a little old. This would be a little better because now we're raising some tax revenue with the January raising the taxes on just the highest income earners in the United States. But you can see the deficit really come from unpaid wars, but really the Bush-era tax cuts, it's not the recovery measures, that's the light blue, that's the stimulus, it's gone, and then the effects of the economic downturn. So that's where, and that's what's been feeding our debt for a while, and then once the downturn was there, we really hit it. Now the line to pay attention here is the red line. The red line is debt held by the public. On the left scale is the ratio of that to GDP, and you can see this hasn't got a grid on it, but although it's sort of flattened out, we're close to 80. That big jump up is the recession. Yeah. So the debt was kind of moving along. It kind of bounced up in the Bush era. That's the hump there near the end. But then that massive shooting up, that straight line almost going vertical, that's the Great Recession. And that comes from a couple places. The economy, we lost economic growth, and then we lost tax revenue. And automatic stabilizers, unemployment insurance, and other things shot up, and we borrowed a lot more money. So and the GDP fell. So all those things together meant that that ratio changed significantly in putting us close to this identified danger zone of 90%. Now, 90% debt to GDP doesn't mean you're out of the woods. It's not a great number, but it's the one where people think really alarm bells go off. Budget's already tightening. The Congressional Budget Office just came out with its forecast for 2013, and it said 1.4% annual growth this year, which is below 2%. Growth in the fourth quarter last year was slightly negative. We're already tightening the budget. CBO predicts unemployment stays at 7.5% through at least 2014. It's this huge, long, we haven't had unemployment persistent at these levels in any time in the post-war World War II period. The deficit's falling, but it's forecast to eventually come up again. And total government spending, you might not think is, oh, this horrible debt, it's growing. Back to stocks and flows. Total government spending is actually falling, but we now have got so much debt in it, and that debt has to be refinanced. An increasingly important component of that debt, not just for other things, it's to pay interest on the existing debt. And we are fortunate right now to have very low interest rates, so that's not costing us a lot. If interest rates go up as the economy grows, that interest share alone of the debt's going to come. And this is total government spending. The key thing is the gray bar is the big recession. You'll see that we are almost back to the government spending level we had before the recession. So this idea that government spending is out of control isn't right. That includes state and local governments, and that's a lot of the story. The United States, the federal government's spending money, but state and local governments have to balance their budgets. Someone's once described the state governments as 50 little Herbert Hoovers. And so when you have to take the unified government position when you think about government spending, and in total, we are back down to about where we were as a percent of the economy before the recession started. So this idea that there's this explosive growth in government spending, the debt is still going up, but our spending as a percent of GDP is flattened out. Now, this is a too complicated chart. I didn't have time to simplify it. The important line is the kind of yellowish line above the red line. This says the debt could be stabilized. All those letters are two things. That's the Budget Control Act, which is the sequestration that's going to kick in. We're going to cut funds, right? Last year, Congress said, oh, no, we're fine. We'll put automatic spending cuts in, and then they put them off, and then they put them off again. But starting on March 1st, those kick in. And there's also now revenue coming in, not much. We extended most of the Bush-era tax cuts, but recaptured some of the revenue from the highest income brackets. So that says the debt, now we're on the debt now, the bathtub full. It's going to track down a little to 217 in the low 70s, and then it starts to track back up as bills come due that we borrowed for Social Security and Medicare in principle. Okay, so those are the numbers. We're not in a great position. We're high up. There's not a lot. It's coming down some. The numbers still aren't where we should be. Economic growth, it's slow. It's going to make it bad. But what's going on? Why is the debt vote broken down? Why is this so hard to accomplish? And we're going to switch here to the arcane. If you think the economics were arcane, wait for the politics of it. There have been 77 times separately since 1962 that the debt ceiling has been raised. And a young congressman named Richard Gephardt in 1979 was given an assignment by Tip O'Neill. He said, nobody likes to take this vote on the debt limit. We get killed. We go home and everyone says, oh, you're borrowing more money again. And Gephardt figured out something called the Gephardt rule, which said when we pass a budget, we automatically assume that the debt limit is raised as part of that vote because we voted for the spending. So we don't have to take a separate vote on the debt limit, and hurrah, no one has to take the vote. We pay our bills. and the Gephardt rule was in place, and everyone said, thank you very much. So even though the ceiling was raised a lot, you didn't have these battles over it. It just went up automatically when the budget was passed. 1994, the Republicans under Newt Gingrich take the House, and they suspend the Gephardt rule. They want a separate vote on the debt limit. They want to use it to leverage spending and to have a political fight and to show their constituents and their members that they're tough on debt. So the votes that we have now, these contentious votes, were a deliberate policy choice in the 90s to engage in this political battle. When the Democrats get back in Congress, they put the Gephardt rule back in, but the Republicans got it back in 2010, and they took the Gephardt rule out. And so now we're back to these debt limit votes. And so here's some of the more extreme statements. Senator Tom Coburn, a Tea Party favorite, said defaulting on the actual bonds that the United States owes the rest of the world, which would be a disaster no matter who you believe and no matter how you feel about debts and deficits. It might be a wonderful experiment, he said. Although we've talked about bipartisanship on the House vote on the fiscal cliff bill, the Republicans in the House voted 151 to 85 against that bill, even though they have the majority there. That was carried by Democrats. Republicans are not on board with most of these things. Newt Gingrich in 2013 said, I've helped close the government twice. He said it actually worked. Remember, the government shutdowns under President Clinton were driven not by a debt limit vote, although they got very close to the debt, to that vote, but just not authorizing spending. And so he has recommended, said, don't do it on the debt limit because of financial crisis, but yes, be willing to shut the government down again because that's the way we're going to get leverage on spending. This current debt limit extension is only good till May 19th, and then we're going to be back in this again. We'll talk more about it, and folks will talk about what the prospects are for getting this out. But I want to compare just the Gingrich quote to, so here's one from a famous politician. The full consequences of a default to America's, which is the strongest credit in the world, a default by the United States would be impossible to predict and awesome to contemplate. We must not do it. That's Ronald Reagan in 1983. As we fight for freedom, we must not imperil the full faith and credit of the United States and the soundness and strength of the American economy. George W. Bush, 2002. We've had a change in even some pretty conservative Republicans about fighting over these issues. Senator Mitch McConnell, the then majority leader of the Senate, now the minority leader, said, I guess he was minority leader of Kentucky, a Republican leader of the Senate, said, the single most important thing we want to achieve for President Obama is that he be a one-term president. Well, they didn't get that. But those politics have not gone away. So I guess I would say that the economics seem possible on getting this manageable and under control, although we still have these long-term problems that other panelists will talk about. But it's very hard to see how we can solve the politics.
I should know how to do this. So I'm Teresa Ghilarducci, and I already told you who I was, but one of the most important things I do is teach macroeconomics to 200 students this semester. And so we together, with my students, are trying to figure out what's going on. And as my students know, and I'll tell you, I'm worried about two things. I'm worried about the deficit, adding to the debt, and that being too high. President Vanzant talked about why that's worrisome. If the debt is too high, there's not enough wiggle room for Congress and the President to get us out of a financial crisis if we encounter another one, or to get us out of a recession if we actually slide back into one. Rick talked about the worrisome fourth quarter results in December. Economic growth was negative. If it happens one more quarter, we are back in a recession. So I'm worried about the deficit and the debt, and I'm worried about the lack of growth. But here's the real problem. I'm worried that if we try to raise revenue now and cut spending to fix the debt and the deficit, it will bring on a recession. All right, so we have to be very careful in our monetary and our fiscal policy to make sure that we put a down payment on our long-term debt, make sure that we monitor our revenue and our spending so it doesn't get worse. But we absolutely can't take measures now to go into another recession. And the fact that fiscal policy, Congress and the President, can't get it together to get that fiscal policy right makes me very, very worried. So let's talk about some of the spending cuts that they're negotiating, as President Vanzant said, in the worst possible way to do negotiations. This is not a process that gets to yes, and I'll give you some definitive answers about what we should do. One of the ongoing conversations have been very dangerous, which is something like, oh, those old people, they're eating the young people, as if we're all reptiles, that we go about eating our young. And those greedy old people are eating the young because they have health care called Medicare. And worst of all, they want their pensions and their Social Security. So some of the language and the rhetoric is to divide the young against the old, as if the young aren't working and will become old themselves. So there's a very insidious rhetoric to divide the generations, and it's insidious, it's misplaced. I want to talk exactly, precisely what the numbers are. We do have a healthcare problem, healthcare cost problem in this country, but it's not because we have people who use healthcare. There are many, many other countries where the population's getting old and everybody has healthcare. So it's not the users of healthcare that are the problem or driving the healthcare cost. It's the cost of healthcare per person that's driving our cost. And we must get those healthcare costs per person down, but it doesn't happen in Congress in budget and short-term budget negotiations. So here's my graph. The top line is the cost of healthcare cost over time, and it certainly is driving the future deficit. What's not driving the deficit is Social Security costs. So I'm going to say this probably 3 times in 10 minutes, which is it's not the population getting older that's causing the debt and the deficit problem. We've known about the population growing older ever since that population were born, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago. Forecasting population growth is about the easiest thing that we can do, and we budgeted for that in our Social Security system. The problem was that we did not expect growth to be so low, or wages to be so low, or unemployment rates to be so persistently high. That's what's driving the Social Security deficit, not the fact that the baby boomers are getting older. You hear this all the time. Remember me when you hear that. It's not true. It's not the aging population that's causing the deficit. It's not the aging population that's causing the deficit. Mandatory spending is other kinds of things that we have to do, judges we have to pay for, the police force. Discretionary spending is welfare and mostly defense, right? Those are not driving the deficit. We do have a healthcare cost problem in this country, but I wish we would be talking about that. We're helping a little bit. The Affordable Health Care Act, the Health Care Act, the Obamacare that was just passed, does seem to be working. We may be driving down what's called the cost curve. In fact, it's been reported that last year was the first time healthcare costs went down for the first time in 53 years. So something might be happening. We may be more efficient. The healthcare cost had a lot of pilot programs to get a lot of preventative health care. As we slouch towards national health insurance for everybody, we are going to make some progress for bending the cost curve. So I'm hopeful there. But I want to talk about the Social Security system. It is so misunderstood, and it is so important and vital for your lives as young workers and for your lives as pre-retirees or retirees. 2/3 of all Americans who are over the age of 65 get most of their income from Social Security. 40% of people over 65 get all of their income from Social Security. It is a huge driver for economic growth. Without that income going to the older people, we would not have consumption of older people in our cities filled with older people. Detroit, New York, Florida. Think of all the places where there's a population of older people. There would not be the aggregate demand without that flow of income into people's pockets. The Social Security system is in long-term deficit. If you look 75 years out into the future, and believe me, no country looks that far out into the future, we are a bit obsessive, we Americans, in being fiscally responsible for this system. All other countries project one generation out, 35 years. So if we are anything, we are the most responsible nation on earth in terms of forecasting our long-term liabilities, and we are the most responsible nation on earth to pay for them because we forecast out 75 years. So forecasting out 75 years, we have what's called a 2% of payroll deficit, meaning that if we raise payroll taxes 2 percentage points, up from 14.1% the employer and the employee pay for half. How many of you have work? How many of you get a paycheck? How many of you have noticed the FICA deduction on your paycheck? That's your Social Security tax. You pay for half, your employer pays for the other half. If that tax rate went up 1% for you and for your employer, there'd be no Social Security shortfall, none at all. And as an economist, I can tell you, if we did that, there'd be no consequences for employment growth. It just isn't that high. I want more revenue going into Social Security now so that we don't have to cut benefits in 30, 40 years. But if we did have to cut benefits in 30, 40 years, the system is self-contained. It would hurt a lot, and we shouldn't do it, but it would not add a penny to the deficit because the system is self. Hold your question. I'll let everybody have a chance, but please write it down and hold it. Yeah. Okay. The way that we can raise revenue for Social Security, and you remember me, whenever you hear someone say Social Security is a problem, this is the way we do it. Right now, the most highly paid CEO is the head of a medical services company in Minnesota. He makes $131 million a year, $131 million a year. He pays Social Security taxes, but he pays up to the limit of $113,000 per year. That means he pays for his Social Security tax by breakfast on January 1st. Or maybe he didn't even go to bed yet and he's still working with a hangover. If we lifted that earnings base, he pays Medicare tax the whole year. But if we lifted that base and he paid throughout the whole year like most of us do, there would be no more deficit. If we raise taxes on everybody, that would solve 100% of the payroll. If we just taxed all earnings, that would solve 100%. But the top paid people would pay more if we raise the earnings cap. Raise the earnings cap, and we've solved the Social Security deficit. You guys could go home now and enjoy your Valentine's Day. I've just solved it. Do not cut benefits by raising the retirement age. Do not cut benefits. We don't have to. If many people, my colleagues in the economics profession, say we should just index the normal retirement age from 67 all the way up to 70. After all, everybody is living longer. That's not true. Only people who make above average, the top income earners, are living longer. It turns out all the longevity gains in the past 20 years have gone to people who make above average. Because of the kinds of work people do and the kinds of environment people live in, low-paid people hardly got any longevity gains. So if we raise the retirement age and make people work longer, you're just going to have that benefit the very top. For people born in 1912, the difference between the top and the bottom are only 2 years of life expectancy. Fast forward for people born in 1941, now the difference is 6 years, and it's bigger if we adjust for race. So do not raise the retirement age. Now, economists have a growth plan. Economists at the International Monetary Foundation, and our own graduate, Robert Poland, who now teaches at UMass Amherst, has a fabulous book called Back to Full Employment. He's laid out a plan to actually have economic growth that will solve our debt and deficit problem. So now I'd like to turn over the panel to our colleague, Derek Hamilton.
So I'm Derek Hamilton. I'm an associate professor in the Milano International I'm going to forget the name of my school, Milano School of International Affairs, Urban Policy, and Management. I've been part of an initiative sponsored by the Ford Foundation called Building Economic Security Over a Lifetime. So a lot of my talk is going to be related to a proposal that me and a colleague have been pushing, which is really designed it's almost designed like a reverse Social Security. It's meant to provide economic security for young adults when they're just entering the prime age to build a lifetime of economic security. Okay. All right, so towards the beginning of his State of the Union address, President Obama stated, "It is our unfinished task to restore the basic bargain that built this country. The idea that if you work hard and meet your responsibilities, you can get ahead, no matter where you come from, what you look like, or who you love. So I ask, what better indicator of ability to get ahead than wealth? The advantages of wealth in our society are clear. Wealthier families are far better positioned to finance elite independent school and college educations, access capital to start a business, finance expensive medical procedures, reside in higher amenity neighborhoods, exert political influence through campaign finance, purchase better counsel if confronted with an expensive legal system, leave a bequest, and/or withstand financial hardship resulting from any number of emergencies. In sum, wealth provides opportunity for human and capital investments and economic security to take risk and shield against financial loss." So why do I describe all of this? Well, before the Great Recession, the typical black family had less than a dime of every dollar in wealth as a typical white family. After the recession, the gap nearly doubled, with the typical black family now having about a nickel for every dollar in wealth as the typical white family. The black-white wealth gap is in excess of $100,000, with the median black family having a little less than $6,000 in net worth. Regardless of age, household structure, education, occupation, or income, the typical black household has less than a quarter of a comparable white household in terms of wealth. Perhaps even more alarming, white head of households whose head dropped out of high school have greater wealth than black head of households who graduated from college. Despite the long-standing pattern of structural racial inequality, there's an emergent post-racial narrative which asserts that racial discrimination and other social barriers are largely things of the past, and that blacks now need to stop playing the victim role and recognize their own fault in the persistence of racial inequality. Post-racial ideology represents a change in political discourse away from some acknowledgement of social responsibility for the conditions of black America. Moreover, blacks are enjoined to stop making particularistic claims on America and solely pursue programs of social change designed to reach all Americans. All these sentiments were expressed plainly by Barack Obama in his Philadelphia More Perfect Union speech. Here's what he says, quote, for the African American community, the path means embracing the burdens of our past without becoming victims of our past. It means continuing to insist on a full measure of justice in every aspect of American life. But it also means binding our particular grievances for better health care, better schools, and better jobs to the larger aspirations of all Americans. The white woman struggling to break the glass ceiling, the white man who's been laid off, the immigrant trying to feed his family. And it means taking full responsibility for our own lives. Both implicitly and explicitly, Obama is declaring that there's nothing unique about the discriminatory barriers faced by black Americans today. However, Obama does seem to uniquely target his personal responsibility rhetoric to black Americans. The election of Barack Obama and the ascendancy of blacks to elite positions, including the CEO of Fortune 500 corporations like AOL, Time Warner, and American Express, and appointments to the highest level of cabinet, such as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, all provide fuel for the post-racial sentiment. Post-racialists argue that these examples of black exceptionalism are the result of individual and familial acts of perseverance and hard work. In fact, during his 2009 address to the 100th anniversary celebrating the NAACP, Barack Obama offers himself and the hard work and parenting behavior of his mother as examples in contrast to less successful black youth. He says, quote, "I was raised by a single mom. I didn't come from a lot of wealth. I got into my share of trouble as a child. My life could have easily taken a turn for the worse. When I drive through Harlem or I drive through the south side of Chicago, I see young men on the corners. I say, there, but for the grace of God go I. They're no less gifted than me. They're no less talented than me. But I had some breaks. That mother of mine, she gave me love. She pushed me. She cared about my education. She took no lip. She taught me right from wrong. Because of her, I had a chance to make the most of my abilities." What Obama omits from his narrative is the fact that his single mother had a PhD, and the fact that he received an elite education both abroad in Indonesia and domestically while on scholarship at one of the best private schools in Hawaii. Instead, his narrative emphasizes the love, motivation, and discipline that his mother instilled, which he implicitly presumes is lacking in the household of his black inner-city comparisons. So if the racial barriers are largely a thing of the past, what explains the dramatic and persistent racial wealth gap? The conventional explanations are, first, in search of immediate gratification, blacks are less frugal when it comes to savings. However, it's not historically been the case, nor is it now the case, that blacks are more profligate than whites. Economists ranging from the conservative Milton Friedman to most recently Maury Gittleman and Ed Wolf all find that after accounting for household income, blacks actually have a slightly higher savings rate than whites. The second conventional explanation is the claim that inferior black portfolio management has resulted in lower asset returns. However, the same Gittleman and Wolf study, based on data before the predatory subprime mortgage market crisis, finds no significant difference in the asset appreciation rates once household income is controlled. This provides another example in which the conventional wisdom, namely that blacks possess a lower financial acumen, is not empirically supported. Indeed, the finding mentioned earlier that white families whose head dropped out of high school have a higher median wealth than black heads who graduated from college demonstrates that not even a college degree shields black families from low levels of asset accumulation. The actual explanation is grounded in sound empirical evidence is that of racial differences in inheritance, bequest, and intra-family transfers. They account for more of the racial wealth gap than any other demographic and socioeconomic indicators, including education, income, and household structure. Beginning with 300 years of slavery in which blacks themselves were considered material assets for whites, there's a long history of government, institutional, and individual acts of discrimination that have limited the ability of black families to acquire and transfer wealth from one generation to the next, right? So it's intergenerational transfers that fuel the racial wealth gap. His history includes the exclusion of blacks at local levels from the post-Depression and World War II public policy, which were largely responsible for the asset development of what we have today of a white American middle class. The biased treatment of blacks in asset markets is not limited to the past. There's ample accounts of ongoing lending and housing discrimination, particularly with regards to the predatory subprime lending and housing crisis. I won't get into those studies today. So what can we do about the racial wealth gap? Market forces and private actions alone are insufficient. The most efficient way would be carefully targeted, redistributed, race-based policies, and if it is the case that such policies are becoming increasingly politically unfeasible, then we need a shift to more dramatic and bold policies that lead to economic security, mobility, and sustainability for all Americans. William Darity and I propose a substantial child trust fund program or a baby bonds program as coined by the recently deceased Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and scholar of African American studies, Manning Marable. The baby bonds program would be designed to provide opportunity to build assets and economic security for all newborns, regardless of race and the privilege or lack of privilege in which they are born. Since about 85% of black families have a net worth below the median household, it is clear that the vast majority of the nation's worth, along with its associated opportunities, are skewed heavily towards the relatively few who are predominantly white. Yet even among only whites, less than 10% of families hold more than 50% of the total white household wealth. The richest 20% of the entire population holds over 80% of the nation's wealth, while the top 1% holds nearly 40% of the nation's wealth. The baby bonds program that we envision would progressively endow every newborn with a trust account. The average trust could be about $15,000 per child and incrementally rise to $60,000 for newborns born into the most wealth-poor families. The accounts would grow at a federally guaranteed annual interest rate of 1.5% to 2%. The accounts could be accessed when the child becomes an adult and used for some asset-enhancing endeavor, such as purchasing a home or starting a new business. If all the roughly 4 million babies born per year were eligible for the program, a crude estimate of the program's cost would amount to about $60 billion a year. Although this simple estimate does not incorporate costs resulting from increased fertility incentives, it also does not incorporate savings resulting from reductions in other federal transfer programs associated with better resourced young adults. The cost could be fully funded based on a fraction of what the federal government already spends on asset-enhancing endeavors. The federal government allocates $500 billion of its annual budget in the form of tax subsidies and savings to promote asset development policies. The bulk of this allocation comes from items like mortgage interest deductions, exclusions of investment income on life insurance and annuity contracts, reduced rates of tax on dividends and long-term capital gains, and exclusion of capital gains at death. The total allocation, which is about 15 times more than what's spent by the Department of Education, does not include subsidies at the local, given the tax breaks to corporations, nor funds at the state and local levels. So at issue is, I'm going to be done in a couple of minutes, at issue is not the amount that was allocated, but to whom the allocation is distributed. The top 1% of earners, those typically earning over $1 million a year, received about 1/3 of the entire allocation, while the bottom 60% of earners received about 5%. If the federal asset budget was allocated in a more progressive manner, federal policies could be transformative for all Americans. The baby bond proposal provides a far more progressive, opportunity-enhancing, and a lot less expensive way than many of the asset tax policies already in existence. The proposal that we have could be fully funded by capping the mortgage interest deductions for wealthy families. So towards the end of the State of the Union, Obama gives us hope. He says, America is not a place where chance of birth or circumstance should decide our destiny. And that is why we need to build ladders of opportunity into the middle class for all who are willing to climb them. Thus we propose that the President and Congress act so that we can truly become a society consistent with the most comprehensive norms of a post-racial society. First, the United States needs to get beyond the unsubstantiated rhetoric that attributes a deficit in personal responsibility on the part of blacks as the explanation for racial inequality, and instead get to the business of eliminating the transmission of racial, economic advantage or disadvantage across generations. Public provisions of the substantial trust fund for newborns from wealth-poor families would go a long way towards achieving this American ideal and provide an opportunity asset-building economic security over a lifetime for all Americans, regardless of race.
Hi, I'm David Plotke. I teach politics, political science. I should also say in introducing myself that because of a train schedule, I have to leave about 9. So if you see me get up, it won't be out of, taking offense at some question or comment that somebody made. Well, here's a couple ways. I'm going to come toward the question of polarization and political trouble in passing a budget, but I think a couple of ways to get at that are quite local and interesting, and I think, putting it very bluntly, people in this part of the country are media saturated but also very innocent about the depth of political division in our country. And let me give 2 examples, both of which are slightly funny. Last time, or I think they are, last term I taught a course for undergraduates about the election. It was appropriate. It was a large course, 100 students, and I did an initial poll. I asked them to put their heads down because I wanted the vote to be private. How many people thought they would vote for Romney? How many for Obama? And I expected, you know, obviously I expected a strong majority for Obama, right? I didn't expect 95-3, which I could take heart in a certain way, but also made it clear that in routine activities around campus, most of the Lang and Parsons student would not encounter a Republican, not have to debate with one, not have their life disturbed by that. I'm not suggesting that we have a sort of emergency kind of, quote, affirmative action program to import lots of students from Hillsdale College or wherever, but simply that we're, you know, though media savvy, we're somewhat isolated. Better one that cuts a little closer to the bone, which is always a good idea, is President Vanzant's predecessor, Bob Kerrey, especially in my faculty, was at times excoriated around here as a right-winger of various kinds, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he was pressed into duty to go to Nebraska to try to rescue Nebraska for the Democrats. And he was running against a woman who was, I would say, I don't want to go into detail, but she was almost in the Michelle Bachmann league. So she's running against Kerry, who is a multi-time senator, you know, war hero, blah, 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 and he loses. He does a decent job, okay? But he loses by 3 or 4 percentage points. There's quite a gap between our normal experience and the way it is in certain parts of the other country. Of the other country, I said that accidentally. But it is as though Nebraska is another country politically, okay? If Bob Kerrey, who, you know, is a recipient of this and that criticism around our town, our community, is regarded as 2 or 3 clear, large steps to the left of what the people of Nebraska are willing to accept, even though he's a zillion times more qualified for the office, well, that says something to you about political polarization that goes beyond any tables that I could put up on the board. There are lots of forms of political polarization in our country. The one that's relevant to us tonight, most relevant, is around fiscal policy and social policy. And what is most distinctive about this feature of political polarization is that the far right, which I can call the Tea Party for short on this dimension, is less isolated on this dimension than others, okay? If I had to stop the talk here after explaining this point, I'd happily do it, but I want to draw a comparison. On the abortion issue, okay, the far right has, over the decades, worked itself into a position in which no form of abortion under any circumstances is ever acceptable to anyone. And in effect, drawn a bright line between its position and the position of many people to its left on abortion who are willing to countenance various forms of restriction on abortion, but in general feel that it should still, in large measure, be something available to women. So there's quite a bright line, and that came out in the election cycle last time. If you remember the crazy talk about what's real rape and what's et cetera, without going into that in great detail, that shone a bright light on the extent to which the far right had separated itself off from mainstream opinion, even mainstream conservative opinion on this question. On fiscal policy and social policy, that there are many people who don't agree with the Tea Party's full program, but are in favor of limiting spending a lot, stopping new government programs, if at all possible, and reducing the deficit. This reality, that is, that there is not a radical separation between the Tea Party and broader parts of a conservative or centrist public, as there is on some other issues, means that the far right which I would say at the public opinion level is about 15 to 20% of the population. At the congressional level, it's about 20% of Congress, can exert a lot of power in a coalitional sense, okay? I went on longer than I meant to in the first part, so I'm going to cut, and cut, okay? Let me boil this down to the problem that Obama faces, okay? The far right, the Tea Party people, have made it clear, and several of the presentations had quotes that illustrate this. For their political purposes, crisis is not so bad. It's not the worst thing. Crisis is better than compromises or losing of a certain type. So to avoid crisis, that means the administration needs to do two things. And when I say them both, this is not going to be linear algebra. This is, in my part of the new school, we can barely do math. The politics department, in Teresa's part, it's accepted that you could actually do percentages quickly and people would get it. So I'm trying to leap across that divide and use some percentages, okay? To get something through Congress, you need 50% plus one, obviously. To have any stability or any room for maneuver, you need to have 55%, something like that. You know, you can't plan to win on 50% plus one. Problem is for Obama, 20% of Congress is unreachable, okay? So what that means is he's got to come up with 2/3 of the non-Tea Party votes in Congress. That's a daunting coalitional task when your party has a minority in one house and a not particularly strong majority. So he then has to do, and I'm being totally blunt about this and not coding it nicely the way he would do, he has to figure out a way to get Republican votes without trading off too many Democratic votes. That's not how he's going to put it, right? He has to figure out the right ratio, or he's not going to, in other words, he can't win the way the way I presume many of you would like him to win, to just talk like he did in his inauguration speech. I'm for this. If you don't like it, F you. Here's what we're going to do, et cetera, et cetera. He can say that, but he can't enact it the way that he could enact health care at the very end. He's got three possible choices of coalitions he could go for, all of which are unappetizing. I will exceed that by 1 minute, but I will be respectful as I do, okay? And when I give these coalitions, I'm really giving them both as recipes in Congress, but also as metaphors for different combinations of things he might propose and accept. One thing that he might try to do, I think this is his first preference on a variety of grounds, is a coalition that includes all but the left 5% or so of Democrats and picks up the left 15 to 20% of Republicans. You can put left in scare quotes for the Republicans if you want, but you know, the Olympia Snows of the world, who's no longer with us.
That's right.
Right. She's still with us. She's just not with us. Second, this is his tough ideological move. The Democratic Party is not homogeneous. He could imagine a coalition in which he would lose the right 10% or so of the Democrats and pick up the left 10% of Republicans if he did it just right. And this would be a razor-thin winning coalition. Might be his favorite in ideological terms, but you can see how everything has to go just right for that, okay? Third one is to get the left 40% of the Republicans and dump the left 15 to 20% of the Democrats. That will be his emergency one. If the first two don't, I've listed them sort of, what he will do is he wants the first one, he'll sincerely go for it, It's bipartisan, not exclusive, but clearly to the center left. The second one is he'll threaten with, right? This is, you say, I'll go for this, I'll break various legs to do this if I have to. And the third one, because he thinks, and this is a long, complicated discussion, but it's an interesting one, but I'm not going to do it. He thinks compromise is better than crisis. So because he thinks that, because he doesn't view the world in the same way that, well, maybe Eric Cantor, but certainly Michelle Bachmann does, he will go for Coalition C if Coalition A and Coalition B are not workable, because he thinks it would be a bad thing to default, et cetera, and you'll hate him, and everybody will feel terrible. But that's the structure that he has before him. Because of the way the Congress is, now, final irony on this, I think academics, well, all of us like ironies, but you don't like this one. It is sort of what the Constitution's supposed to do, which is the Constitution is bad at rapid change in certain ways, very good at protecting minorities from majority tyranny. Well, what happens in a situation where somebody like me wouldn't be terribly unhappy to see this particular minority tyrannized a little bit, but the Constitution is working quite effectively on their behalf, and therefore giving a very tightly organized now, coherent, strong, and to some degree growing minority on the far right the power to bring, I think they bear the main responsibility for bringing us perilously close to a very bad fiscal situation. Thank you.
So again, we have lots of people with lots of questions. So a question, 1 or 2 sentences at the most. And again, I'm going to privilege students first.
Maybe take a couple.
Any yeah.
Maybe
Just,
take a couple.
any students?
Check.
Any students? Okay, go ahead. Please stand up and so everyone can hear. And we have a microphone also.
Hello. The question is more directed to the political scientist.
Sure.
My assumption is that the president wishes to lose and pick up the next vote in the next term, where he picks up tons of Democrats, and that shouldn't even have to wait for that election, because before then, people are going to start knowing they're about to lose badly because they brought the country to a halt.
Okay. All right.
Is that true?
No. The reason is, putting it simply, Obama won despite people being very unhappy with his economic performance. If the country goes into recession, this is my prediction, it won't matter what causes it. You know, it'll be blamed on Obama and the Democrats. So that's another reason he can't have a crisis. Because what you're saying, I get it, okay, but it's pretty amazing that a president got reelected with 8% unemployment. Okay, we could go through all the reasons for that, but if there is the recession Teresa was reasonably warning about the possibility of, unemployment is 8.6% in 2014. I sure wouldn't, well, much less being Bob Kerrey in Nebraska, I wouldn't want to be Democratic congresspeople in New Jersey running for re-election.
What is the unemployment rate now, students? 7.5. Right, so we're a lot further than 8.6. Okay, thanks, Lauren.
I think the question of this this forum is can America continue to be governable? I don't think that's the right question. I think the question has to do with we have never resolved the basic divisions with which this country was founded. We never resolved the federalism, anti-federalism debate. We never resolved the issues around the Civil War. This country was founded by and for the
Do you have a
upper
question,
class.
sir?
This is the question.
Yeah.
That is the issue. Is this country for the upper class, what role does the working class, even
right.
the middle class,
Yeah.
have in the governance of this country? We've
Sure.
never resolved those things.
Sure.
We
Let's
came
ask
close
the
to a
panel.
nonviolent civil war.
Sure.
You mentioned about Kerry's election in Nebraska. Well, there's a deep resentment in this country, and it's getting
Yeah.
more and more angry.
No, it's a good question. That's a good question. Anybody want to take it? Rick?
I grew up in Kansas, Kansas, suburbs of Kansas City. And so, I mean, I'm sort of going beyond my remit as an economist, but yeah, it's, the country is, David emphasized this too, you get a funny view of it in New York, you get a funny view of it in Kansas too, and I'm not moving back, so. But populism in the United States, you point about, people are angry, but it's very much an anti-government form. I'm really feeling I'm treading on David's turf, but the United States is just what David said. We're not founded to do things rapidly in the government. We don't like the state. We don't like a powerful state. There's a lot of restrictions on the government doing stuff. People on the left like that when there's a Bill of Rights. You don't want your phone tapped. You don't want a bunch of other stuff, but a lot of other people don't like government strength as well. So, but I don't know how you overcome that in the current system. The government's set up not to do very much very fast. And what David said about the coalitions is right. So that might be right structurally, but here we are. Right.
Well, Derek, are the rules written for the rich, or do the working class have a voice?
One thing I wanted to say is that although we're very polarized, a lot of the discourse seems to be getting more and more united. Unfortunately, not in the right way of my pleasing. I think we are starting to get to an individualistic society where we're removing notions of social responsibility from being an issue with the government. That we're promoting individualism, and that seems to be happening across parties, Democrats and Republicans. So the rhetoric of personal responsibility. One of America, we have a fair shot in America, and if you don't make it, there's something that must be wrong with you. And I guess the dangerous part of it is even the subaltern group is starting to adopt that ideology more and more, which prevents them from having collective efficacy to address their condition in life.
I have a student here.
Yes. Oh, hi. If it was up to me to fix Social Security, I would remove the wage cap, and all our problems would go away. But no politician is embracing that. What is being embraced by Obama, our liberal Democratic president, is something called the chained CPI, which would destroy Social Security benefits for me, who's getting them, and for young people in this room. If he's liberal, and certainly more liberal than Romney would have been, how can we change the mindset to say that Social Security benefits don't have to be cut, that all we need to have to do is change the payroll tax from the most regressive tax that we pay, but everyone says, no, we have to cut benefits and we have to raise the Medicare age.
Yeah, and so this is a really good example about how actually our government may be governable, because Social Security is a technical program. It's been, everybody agrees on the numbers, and the politics are being played out. So you had a very precise understanding of the program. The president seems to be on the right of many advocacy groups. He seems to be embracing this idea that we can cut benefits a little bit. And what I'm seeing is a lot of advocacy groups, and you're part of one, you're very well informed, saying no cuts in benefits, the revenue is easy to solve. So I think that's the way it gets played out. I think you examined that exactly right. So it's just keep it up.
Well, I
We just
spoke to-
need political, this is politics, right? So I'm gonna stop you there. Okay, thank you. The student here?
Hi. So my question's in regard to immigration and expansion of economy. And I just wanted, because I know the Republicans have referred to it as the Reclaim American Job Caucus before. So I was just wondering if there's any evidence proving that the influx of immigrants is contingent on the expansion of growth, or if the expansion of growth is contingent on.
All right, so the
influx
question
of
is,
immigrants.
does immigration help economic growth?
Yes, most economists believe that immigration, documented or undocumented, adds to economic growth. It provides more workers, it provides more businesses, it provides more customers and consumers. It's actually a pretty widely held finding, empirical finding among economists that immigration helps the economy, doesn't hurt it. And then, of course, in the longer run, you look at, you compare the demographic situation as tight as it is in the United States. One reason our demography is better and we have some hope on these social programs is that we're open to immigration. As bad as we can be about immigration issues, we are way better than European countries and other places. Again, largely through advocacy groups here. We all came here from somewhere else, right? Or our parents or families did. So.
Yeah, David.
Let me complicate the economist's account with one problem. Part of the reason why immigration is pretty good for growth, and it is that we treat especially non-legal immigrants very badly in terms of social benefits.
Absolutely.
Okay? Well, so here's the problem. If we do what there's a broad consensus for doing, that is to normalize the status of many of the 10 to 12 million people who are here not legally, there's going to be a big bill, especially with medical care, but with some other things, okay? So what this will lead back to pretty quickly is that if you haven't figured out some growth path, this is going to create another collision with the various things that we're talking about here, because if you just cost that out and attach it, especially in some states, to treat it's cheap to have people work in all the nearby restaurants for $6 an hour and not have a claim on social resources. It's not necessarily so cheap if you actually treat them decently, though it's still economically good to have them.
Although one caveat is if they're undocumented and off the books, then that's lost tax revenue also.
The interesting thing, political point about immigration is that the Republicans are very split, because Republicans who are small owners, small business owners, really like the cheap labor, and the undocumented worker is a very weakly empowered worker. And yet the other rhetoric on the other side is a nativist, anti-immigrant. So it's a very, very weak issue
At the risk of repeating, I'm sorry to act like a professor here, but that's what we do. Aside from the abortion, in addition to the abortion issue, it's another illustration of the dynamic I was trying to point out. The hard position of the far right on immigration really doesn't have purchase now. That's why it was so easy to come up with the compromise. They'll fight it, but it's full of racism, people see, full of xenophobia, full of lack of basic human empathy for people in here. So that's very different from the Tea Party stuff on fiscal policy, et cetera, unfortunately.
I'm just looking for students. All right. In the back.
I have a question for, I forgot your name, the economist, the lady who was talking about first question would be, can you elaborate a little bit more on like how the war is not, or defense spending is not really like a major cause of, like the government debt or whatever? And then the other thing I'd like to elaborate on is like the amount of money that the government gives away or passes out as far as student loans, because I am pretty aware that in, I think, 2010 or 2009, they gave around $870 billion. I know that's like a lot of money. So if you could, I don't know.
So if you look at the government spending, there's two portions: the mandatory portion and the discretionary portion. The discretionary portion is actually a smaller part than the mandatory portion. Mandatory portion is mostly Social Security and Medicare. So let's just look at this discretionary portion. Big items, the biggest item is defense spending. So it actually does matter. It's just that it hasn't gone up as much as healthcare costs. That's all I meant. Student debt is a problem because of the indebtedness to the households, but it's not actually driving the government deficit. But you're right, just like our checkbook is a sign of our priorities, the government's checkbook, what we spend money, is a sign of our priorities. And actually helping students go to college actually not big and not our priority. So that has to change as well.
I want, one comment on the war spending, though, that when we went into the Great Recession, we were already in a very bad deficit situation. We shouldn't have been in it. We had economic growth, and one of the big contributors to that too high deficit when the recession hit was the unpaid wars in Iran and Afghanistan. So it was one of the slides. I assume we'll put these slides up. I'm sorry, Iran. Well, every place, right? Iraq in that case, but that was a big contributor to an existing deficit. And then when the recession hit, it really shot up. We're going to post, I assume, the slide. I had a slide in there that broke that down, and it's got the war spending in it.
Yeah, most of this will be posted. Thanks. Okay, thanks, Lauren.
Hi. Looking forward to 2016, I'm very concerned about more of the same old, problems within Congress. But my biggest concern is actually it started with my home state of Virginia, which I feel like I should move back to because they need my vote.
Register.
And congressional redistricting. That's my biggest concern right now. Could you address that, I guess?
Oh, that'd be yours, David.
I have nothing to say beyond what you know, that it's bad. And the 2000, let's see if, well, the current, it's not 216, the next redistricting is 2020,
because of
right?
census.
So I don't think 2016 is pivotal for anything in particular, except probably some more Republican fooling around with electoral laws, right, in some of these tight states. But the current configuration, which gives a lot of power to Republicans at the state and local levels, state and legislatures, and in Congress, augurs poorly for Democrats. So you could have for a while, you could have a kind of almost two-level thing where Democrats can win the presidency and lose a lot of the rest, and this could be a very familiar configuration that we now have. It's not going to go away in 10 minutes.
Rick, did you have a...
No. I mean, David Cott, everyone knows the fact, right, that the 2010 Republicans did well in the Tea Party wave. They redistricted. Although this isn't always this positive, Democrats got in aggregate a lot more votes for the House, but the Republicans have a majority. Some states like Pennsylvania in particular, that Obama won, actually. I think the Pennsylvania delegation is 2/3 Republican in the House. So that gerrymandering took place and is likely to, but it's not going to change again.
Okay, good, thank you.
Hi, good evening. Talib Hudson, Urban Policy Program at Milano.
Yeah.
I'd like each of you to respond, giving your respective content areas of expertise, to the notion that forecasting out, as you mentioned, the United States is becoming more black and brown over time, and less Caucasian. So what impact will that have, not just from a political perspective and a social justice perspective, but also from an economic and fiscal perspective as well?
Well, it's becoming more of a Hispanic, Asians are driving the population. Whites fell from 10 years from 75% of the population, Lauren just crunched some of these numbers, to 68%. So we see a steady decline in the number of whites. It's going to be a younger population, actually. Rick mentioned that we are fortunate in the United States that we have a lot of immigrants and we have a high fertility rate. So politically, it also means more Democratic votes, and it probably means a hope for the labor movement, because those populations are more likely to vote for unions. So that actually may mean more government spending on social insurance and maybe a chance for the baby bond proposal to pass.
It is more black and brown. The only state we see a lot of white increase is Utah, actually. And if you look demographically, it's a largely Mormon population, and they're spiking. But other than that, the Democrats are right. Yeah, well, it shows up in the numbers, right, quite clearly. I guess I'd echo something David said before about just the immigration issue, particularly as a wedge issue, and that's why Obama and the Democrats want to drive that in some sense. Some Republicans are they can see these Hispanic votes. I don't think they think much hope on African American voters, but they get that they're losing this Hispanic growth, and they have to figure out some way to accommodate that. But there are elements in their party, in my home state in Kansas, in the Southwest, and something where this is just, it's treasonous to think about immigration reform. So in addition to the merits of that issue, and that's a place where I think Obama's trying to play a little offense, is trying to wedge that issue. Economically, opportunities open up. On the other hand, non-whites have a lower education college acquisition rate for financing and a whole bunch of other reasons, and so there is there's some worry about how folks will get the right educational credentials and job opportunities to keep things going.
So I'd say that politically, I'm cautiously optimistic that these changing demographics could lead to substantial change that we might not have seen before to change the fabric of society. But it's not new, right? America has been through immigrant groups coming in and what were considered non-white groups who now are considered white. The definition of white just is dynamic. It changes over time. So whether these new immigrant groups will be incorporated into an in-group or not, we don't know how this is going to play out. So again, I'm cautiously optimistic about coalitions and things like that. But I've also heard elsewhere that it's in people have made the economic argument that it's in the interest of the country that we develop the capacity of these non-white groups because they're going to be the majority of the country. I guess I'm public. I said that I wouldn't publicly say anything against that, but this is public, so I guess I am. I think the focus is wrong-spirited because, frankly, economics could be if we look at growth as the outcome measure, we can grow as a result of exploitation. So by having exploitation, companies can gain profits and grow. The argument of developing the capacity of these other groups is a human capital argument, that you can lead to economic growth by untapped human capital if you put resources in there. We've had periods we grew during periods of slavery, right? So it's not as if developing the capacity of subaltern groups always necessarily leads to growth. Yep. What I think is the real argument is a question of fairness, right? Instead of always thinking about economics and growth, or if we define our economic argument solely in terms of growth without thinking about equity and individuals' capacity to have life happiness, that's a problem in and of itself. But I'd personally go with arguments that are more addressed that we want to provide opportunities for all people regardless of race.
So I don't know your name. Question. Let me complicate things for you in just a little bit. I'm not sure what the non-white population is going to be like, and people in I don't know. I'm looking around. I don't know who's what, but one of the interesting things now is when asked, 55 to 60% of people categorized as Hispanic, if they're asked to put themselves in a racial group, they say they're white. Mm-hmm. So there's this casual idea that goes around that there is this group, clearly defined group of non-whites that includes Asians. It's not how it is. But on the other side, one could say that Hispanics are now 70% Democrat in their voting. Mm-hmm. And I think that the Republicans lost that, and it's too late. I think that's what my judgment is. Do I know that scientifically? No. Mm-hmm. But I think they drank the abortion Kool-Aid, and they thought that Hispanics were motivated mainly by what they imagined to be conservative family policies. And I think, to make an analogy, that the actual analogy there is with homosexuality and parts of the African American community, where it's obviously the case that there's plenty of black preachers and plenty of African Americans who are not enthusiastic about the gay rights movement. There's no, et cetera. Is that going to cause people to vote for Republicans? Yeah. It's just not. So there's this sense on the Republican part of imagining that these Democratic ethnic or racial minority groups, however you want to call it, who have conservative cultural elements on some things can be pulled to the right on those grounds. They've been trying that. They have no memory. They've been trying that for 30 years, and it always fails except at the margins. Here's an extreme example of that. The data on African American women in 2012 are almost unprecedented in two-party competition. It's like 95% of African American women voted Democrat. That's impossible. There are like 4 African American women in the United States who voted for Romney. So the idea that you're going to...
Or didn't vote.
The idea that you're going to appeal to I'm just making an analogy to show you what I mean. The analogy that you're going to peel off a big chunk of African American women, of grandmas who aren't very excited about young gay men, who will then vote Republican, is absolutely nuts. Sorry.
So I want a quick side in support of Derek's point about how ethnicity changes, at least for whites. There's a great book called How the Irish Became White, which, if people don't know it, should really read it. It's possible when you're black.
There's a more recent study that's even more relevant to this current phenomena about Latino choices in identity and race, and it's done by Stephen Trejo and Brian Duncan, where they find patterns of how people are even identified, that Latinos that are in the higher echelons, the most highly educated, they tend to have offsprings that might be of mixed race, and the children don't recognize their Latino heritage, period. I'm not saying that's widespread, but there's a trend like that. And in their paper, what they find is, like, the widespread belief is, one of the puzzles is, why doesn't the Mexican American have the same assimilation pattern as some other groups when they came? Well, Steve Trejo and Brian Duncan are arguing that if you were to incorporate those individuals who self-identify out, that the patterns aren't so dissimilar.
I'd like to ask a question about wealth distribution and its implications for the economy and for politics, never mind for health. When the Soviet Union disintegrated, health deteriorated, life expectancy deteriorated. As we move toward a wider distribution of wealth, does that undercut democracy in the way it seems it might? And what are its implications for the success of the economy?
I'd like to speak to that. I am stunned by the data on mortality differences by class and race. In 1950, we did this at SEPA for Joe Stiglitz, who just wrote a book, by the way, I'll recommend that, The Price of Inequality, to look at not just wealth and income, but actually one of the most important aspects of human life was who among us can live a normal human lifespan. In 1950, the lifespan of an older white American and an older black American was exactly the same. Fast forward to the present time, and the difference was about 6 or 7 years. And it's not because of race, it's because of income and wealth. I told you before in my presentation that all the longevity gains in America in the past 30 years have gone to people with more wealth and the highest income. There is something dramatically happened that comes to the very root of human existence, is that some of us can live a normal human lifespan and take advantage of all those advances, and some of us are not. So I think it goes, wealth and income and distribution is coming to actually define us as what we do as a nation in terms of equity.
Got it.
It's stunning. Yeah. Right here? Or just right there? Okay, good. Exactly. Okay, thanks, Lauren.
I haven't heard you guys talk anything about how technology is influencing any of these aspects. Technology power is increasing or doubling every 2 years, and a lot of people seem to think that, a lot of these machines are now entering the workplace and replacing people. They said that after the recession, the vast majority of the jobs that were replaced were the upper people,
Right.
and the middle class jobs are the ones that have not been replaced because they've actually been replaced by machines.
Yep.
So some people are of the belief that machines are eventually, in the next 100 years or so, going to actually replace the vast majority. Some people say 70, 80, 90% of the population is going to be unemployed because machines have taken over jobs. Do any of you have any comment on that?
The economic question.
Yeah, I don't. There are these guys at MIT who've just written a book about robots moving into lots of lines of work. This is an old fear. I guess I don't believe it.
It's 300 years
Every time there's a
They're
innovation
saying that
in
it's
these
already
changes.
happening. Even Apple is.
Yeah, well, in
replacing
1962, they said automation and UNIVAC and computers were going to take over employment
Yeah,
as well. It happens all the time. There's a question about where new jobs come from, but the displacement effect of the machinery, I mean, maybe they'll get that good. There's limitations on what robotics can do right now. The
Limitations are very quickly.
no, yeah, well, yeah, but
Didn't
but sure. But it's not clear that, for instance, cell phones are more dramatic than the telegraph was, or the telephone, or television, or the printing press, right? And those are all technological innovations that actually are quite associated with growth. So in general, technological, we do have to think about as a society how the rewards and benefits get distributed from that, but technological growth generally is a driver for growth, and people think of new ways to get employed off it. There's always been this fear, and in particular lines of work, it will displace stuff. You know, it always displaces some occupational group. The famous Luddites, for whom I actually have a great deal of sympathy, were weavers who broke stocking frames because that made it a lot cheaper to weave cloth, but over time, an economist would say a lot cheaper woven cloth is a benefit to the whole society, and what we need to do is figure out how people make transitions. It's not a static economy, it grows.
Derek.
I guess it changes the economy, so some jobs go away, new jobs come up. But I wanted to, I guess, talk about some of the rhetoric behind the technological change also, which is that there's a skills gap, that a lot of the employment deficits are due to an untrained labor force. The empirical data doesn't seem to support that notion. It seems to come out as rhetoric. It becomes, again, part of this narrative of personal responsibility in individuals. We find that across the skills level, across individuals with various skills, there's a job deficit. So.
What do you think is fair, Lauren? Go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, Lauren.
That's right.
If the political impasse didn't exist,
Yes.
what do you think could be done to fix the financial
Oh,
situation?
great question. So I think if there was a more harmonious political debate, that Social Security and Medicare would be on its way to be fixed. So a big driver of government spending, it would be solved in a much more balanced way. Lots of very important political issues, but that, at least, those programs would be off the table. Right.
I would nuance it on the program. I think we do have to think some about healthcare costs, which affect the private economy and the government economy. So that we have a budget problem in Medicare, but it's, as Teresa said, because we have a healthcare problem in the entire economy. Private businesses are facing the same kind of problems in the growth in healthcare, and so we have to figure some way to get that under. I'm a big fan. We've all got our favorites. Derek told you about his bond program. I'm a big fan of the so-called Tobin, or stock transfer tax. You could raise $350 billion with a 0.03% of a tax on stock transactions. And New York, including our Democratic Senator Charles Schumer, will fight that to the death. So I think there's lots of sensible, I mean, I think that was the thrust of some of what I was saying. There are a lot of practical ideas out there that we simply can't get to when, as Romney did last year, and it reflected this Tea Party position, when someone says, would you take $1 in tax increases for every $10 in spending cuts? He said no. There have been some Republicans in Congress in this latest debate who have said, I think it'd be better to have a default than to raise a dime of revenue. I mean, this is a deeply felt position, as David described, and it's centered in the Tea Party folks, but it resonates with a lot of other people as well. So that, again, that to me is the paradox. I think there's a ton of sensible ideas on the table. You know, carbon taxes. There's a whole bunch of ways you could think about things that are socially useful and would raise revenue. A lot of ways to make the tax code fairer now, increase investment in that, but we can't seem to get to them.
So let me talk about this in a different way, slightly, to address your question. If the Tea Party if the bulk of the Tea Party people were sent to Mars tomorrow, by whatever means, okay?
We got to be job creative.
Then I think, I think, we wouldn't be taught. Here's the good news and then the complicated news. The good news is we wouldn't be having this session. It's a fine session, but we wouldn't be facing impending politically manufactured crisis, okay? The compromise would be between Obama and Boehner on a good day, and it would have three parts, and it wouldn't make all of us happy. One part would be tax increases, not just on the top 1%, but tax increases going down farther to get at the top 5 or 10% of the population. Two would be new spending, not just on everything Obama would like, but on things that are plausibly related to some growth project. And not just that are nice things, but are infrastructural, education related, et cetera, et cetera. Three, part of the compromise would be, and Teresa would go nuts, but that's how it would be, some fooling around with Medicare and Social Security that would be both symbolic, that would keep Boehner in the room, and in the only thing that I disagreed with in what she said, and we can't have a panel where everybody, even when people do actually love each other, you can't have a panel where everybody just doesn't even. She gave an all else equal account of how Social Security and Medicare are not the problem. She's right in that regard, but if low growth continues, and you have to deal with these deficit pressures, then the impulse to do something with Social Security and Medicare will be very hard to resist, even though you're analytically right. It's not the cause. So that's the compromise. You send the Tea Party people to Mars. You raise taxes significantly. You put real money into growth projects, and you fool around at the edges with Medicare and Social Security, partly for symbolic politics, so the Republicans can say, we got something out of this. And
Derek,
but that won't happen.
If America was governable, what would we do?
Well,
So I'd say, first off, the compromise is not the harmony that would be fundamentally transformative for America, where we'd have a more fair America. So I guess I wouldn't be in support of the compromise. But I'd say that obviously baby bonds is something that I think would be fundamentally transformative, because it would give everyone the access to building assets the same as somebody who might be born into a trust fund. It would provide that opportunity for everyone. A second one, I probably don't have enough time to get into in too much detail, but that'd be a federal job guarantee. And the purpose of that would be to remove the threat of unemployment for all workers, so that, and we have projects that we can build. Again, I won't get into all the details unless I'm asked, but I think that those two programs would fundamentally change the fabric of America. It would avoid stigmatizing certain groups, certain types of individuals that might be formally incarcerated. It'd get rid of some of the discriminatory effects that take place in the labor market. It'd remove the need to do things like minimum wage. It would remove some of the burdens attached to trying to pass health care, because the government would be at least some base level to discipline the private sector. And I guess I'll say one last thing about it is, in an increasingly global economy, some of the low-wage jobs in which America is becoming less and less competitive, well, if they go away as a result of a federal job guarantee, I say good.
Yeah. Two more questions, so let's make them good. All right, and short. Sorry.
It's a short question. I'm curious to know why all the panels, and the gentleman left, I'd like to have heard his answer, take for granted that the Tea Party types hate government. Because I know people who are like that, and they love their Social Security checks, and they love their Medicare checks.
Yeah.
And the United States Army officers retired love their pensions. And many of these big shots want all sorts of government installations all over the country.
We got it.
I think they're a bunch of hypocrites.
We got it.
They don't want what I like, they want what they like.
We got it. We got it.
Yeah.
I'll take it.
Senator Kennedy used to tell a story about someone who came up to him very sincerely after a town meeting in Massachusetts and says, "Senator, tell the government to get their hands off my Medicare."
Right.
But it is this
ill-informed.
disjunction. David would speak about this. People think that they paid into a trust fund and they own it. There are rationalizations for all that stuff. And an economist would say we're all self-interested and we like the things that we like and those things that other people don't like. Russell Long used to say, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fella behind the tree. So it's built in. I mean, I think we could do more in educate now. Social Security now prints out on the check, right? That was the thing Senator Moynihan put in, like how much you got, how much you put into it, what your employer put into it, what the interest came from. Helps a little bit, but not a lot.
Yeah. Wait a second. Derek, did you want to add to it? Yeah.
So I see the Tea Party, and this is my normative view, is largely reactionary to economic hard times. And the face of the government at the time was seemingly liberal. Not actually liberal, but with Obama in office and at the collapse of the economy, you're going to get some political reaction. And because he was, like I said, seemingly a liberal, you had this Tea Party movement. So I guess I would, David left, but I would probably disagree with him about the duration and the nature of it. I don't know how, right? I think it's just reactionary.
Okay.
I'd refer to E.J. Dionne, another great book called Why Americans Hate Politics. I mean, Americans don't like government. A lot of you here we don't like the government, right? But there's different things about it we don't like. It's a big piece of our political culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just something we have to work. It's built into our institutions. We don't, again, like I said before, when it taps our phones or, denies rights or does this, but at the same time, we want the state to do something. There are other folks who dislike it for different reasons.
Okay, let's finish with one question. Here. Student. Thank you.
Given the U.S. debt is growing, how would it put pressure on the relationship between U.S. and China, given that they're both struggling with their own domestic issues?
Right.
Oh, I don't think it's a problem that China borrows money. We always say this fear. One, the debt's not growing. Actually, it's stabilizing. It's stabilizing at a very high rate as a ratio to GDP, but it's not growing. And the fact that people, Chinese or whoever they are, want to borrow American money at extremely low rates is not, I think, a worry. They got to cash the money back in at some point. It's holding U.S. bonds is a good thing. This is more Social Security. It's a related line. It's one of my favorite stories, so I'm going to tell it. The late Robert Eisner used to say, well, George Bush on Social Security said, oh, government's going to have so much debt, we're going to have all these worthless IOUs. Treasury bonds aren't going to be, they're going to be horrible. It's going to be worth anything. So Eisner says, here's your thought experiment about United States debt. Your rich Uncle Sam dies and leaves you a key to the safe deposit box. You open up the safe deposit box and it's full of U.S. Treasury bonds. Do you say, oh my God, I'm bankrupt? This is horrible. They're worth a lot. I think we need to be careful about not letting the debt to GDP get out of control, but the fact that other people borrow the money, as long as we can keep that ratio in order, I don't see as a big problem.
But I hear your worry. So the question is, we have our own debt and deficit problem. We're 90% of GDP. We don't have much wiggle room if we're going into a recession. And then the other big economy in the world is also going in recession. Yes, they owe our debt, and that's probably not a problem. It probably means we need to cooperate. But the other problem is the biggest other economy may be going into recession. We have a lot of advantage sitting here because we have the world's currency. Everybody wants to hold our dollars. What if the other big economy starts to trade actually in their currency? We have even less wiggle room. So I'm not going to be as optimistic. I think we have a problem if the rest of the world is going to go into recession. But we have an opportunity to be much more interdependent. So actually my forecast is that the economic interdependence will probably mean a lot more political sophistication. So it could be very hopeful.
So I agree with Rick about the debt to GDP ratio. You don't want it to get too high. But it could, I think part of the reason for its highness, and Rick mentioned this, is because of recession. So that indeed is cyclical. We won't always be hopefully we won't always be in a recession. But I think the whole discussion about debt and deficit is in part a scare tactic. The Federal Reserve has shown us their capacity to intervene, and we neglect that portion of our government when we I guess semi-government, when we talk about the debt and the deficit. During the financial crisis, we saw their ability to come up with multi-trillion dollars worth of funds to bail out the finance industry. So I don't think our debt and deficit is as much of a crisis as we make it out to be.
I want to applaud everybody. This was very much a new school conversation. Thank you for being here. This was videotaped, and our slides will be available too. So thanks a lot. We'll see you at other events. Thank you.